Hi everybody, and welcome to this video on research designs for Stage 1 psychology. So this is part of the science inquiry skills that you need to know in terms of how we do certain experiments and investigations in psychology. So let's get started. Okay, so broadly defined, research designs are the plans researchers use to answer their question and hypothesis. So in other words, the way experiments and investigations are designed or set up. So depending on what we're actually trying to find out or what we're trying to investigate will depend on what design we should use. So for certain experiments, it's more appropriate to use an experimental design, whereas for other questions or other hypotheses, it's better to use observational or qualitative. So it really does depend on the hypothesis or question being asked as to what design we use. But as the term suggests, to put it very simply, it's the plans researchers use to answer their question and hypotheses. So how do we design our experiment or investigation to answer our question and hypothesis as best as possible? So there are three different types: experimental, observational, and qualitative observational. Now for the last one, qualitative observational, sometimes this is just called qualitative, sometimes it's called qualitative observational. Both are correct. Okay, so you can just refer to it as experimental, observational, and qualitative, but qualitative observational is also fine. So let's look at these in more detail. We're going to start with experimental design. So this is the one that is the most controlled. And like I said to you all in class, the one that you are probably already used to, having done other sciences at school. So the essential elements of an experimental design: there's always the presence of a control group. So the control group does not receive the treatment, or in other words, does not receive the independent variable, whereas the experimental group does receive the treatment or the independent variable. So the control group gives us a means for comparison to see whether the IV actually had an effect or not. So the control group is very, very important. We can compare the results between our control group and experimental group to see if the IV has had an effect like we've hypothesized. Other essential elements of the experimental design includes random allocation of participants. So in other words, participants have just as much likelihood of ending up in the control group or experimental group. It's completely random as to which group they end up in. This makes it so the groups are equivalent as possible. Another essential element is that we are always testing a hypothesis. There is always pre and post testing. So what this means is that we'll test the participants without the independent variable and then test them with the independent variable that links to control and experimental group. But it also refers to we do our experiments over and over and over again. So we replicate the experiment several times. This is to make sure that our results are consistent. Now, in an experimental design, the IV is always manipulated. We always have control over that as the researcher. And it's done in a controlled setting, such as a lab. It doesn't always have to be a lab, though, like I said in class. So it's not your traditional lab, typically with Bunsen burners and taps and things like that. A lab to us may just be a room with a projector or a room with just the necessary apparatus. It can also be done outside. So especially when we're doing driving trials, it wouldn't obviously be appropriate to introduce variables and let people drive on the main roads and so on. So we may do it on a controlled track that we have control over. So it's still outside, but it's still done in a controlled way. Nevertheless, experimental designs are done in a controlled setting. Sometimes inside, sometimes outside. So the good thing about experimental designs, the advantages, is that it's easy to replicate. Because it's done in a controlled setting and we have all the control as the researcher, it's easy to do over and over again to make sure that our results are consistent, which is a good thing. It also maximizes control of extraneous variables because, again, we have so much control with this particular design. We can control when we do it, we're very specific with the instructions, we randomly allocate our participants, and we're manipulating the IV. We can get rid of or reduce greatly the extraneous variables, which, like I said in my previous video, we don't want. We can also make generalizations. So what this means is that we can make correlations between our IV and our DV. So we can say confidently, if the results were in our favor, that yes, the IV does have an effect on the DV. We can make generalizations and explanations or correlations between the IV and the DV, which is a good thing because that means we can make more solid conclusions. However, the experimental design isn't always the best choice to use. There are some disadvantages with this design as well. Because it's done in a controlled setting, it may not be applicable to the real world, so it lacks what we call external validity. So in other words, when we do an experiment in a lab or a controlled room, we may not get the same results as we would in the real world of psychology. So that can be a real issue. It may not represent the entire population. There's only so many people we can fit into a lab or a controlled area. So if we've got a very small sample size, that's not going to represent the entire population of interest, and that's an issue as well. There can be ethical concerns. There are some variables that are just unethical to manipulate and control because it will distress the participants or it will have negative effects on them in some way. So I think the example I gave in class, or an example I can think of, is violent video games. It wouldn't be very ethical of me as a researcher to randomly allocate children to play violent video games. That would be unethical. There would be concerns for their welfare after they see the content of such games, potentially. There are also some variables that just can't be manipulated. It's impossible. They're pre-existing. So because of that, we would have to use a different design. So all designs have advantages and disadvantages, including experimental. So this is the design that typically, again, like I said before, you're used to. It's done in a very controlled way, very systematic way. You have control over the IV and it's, done in a controlled setting. But again, for psychology, that doesn't always work. So because of that, we've got two other designs that we can use that are maybe more appropriate. So we've got our second design, which is observational. Now, the essential elements of this design is that it allows for research in a natural setting of the participants. So rather than being in a lab like the experimental design, observational, the participants are in their natural setting. So they're in their natural work environment or school environment or just going about their daily business. We don't confine them to a lab or a controlled area. Now, this may be more appropriate and also may be more ethical depending on what we're looking at. Now, only associations between variables can be made. We can't make correlations or explanations. Because we have no control with this design, we can only make possible associations. So yes, maybe there is a relationship between the IV and the DV. We can't say that for sure with this design. We have very little control with this design. All we're doing is observing our participants and basically recording their results with very little interference from us. Now, another essential feature of this design is the IV is not manipulated. It is pre-existing. So things like gender and eye color, those are some examples we've talked about in class already. We obviously can't manipulate those. They're pre-existing. They were there before we came along, in other words. So the IV is not manipulated. It is pre-existing with no manipulation from us whatsoever. So if we can't manipulate the IV, we would obviously go with an observational design. And if it's more appropriate that they're in their natural setting, we would go with this design also. So the good thing about this design is that it allows for more complex aspects to be studied. So things that are more appropriate to study in the real world rather than in a lab situation, we can certainly do this. So a lot of animal studies are used with this design. So animals will be observed rather than controlled in their natural habitat or their natural enclosures or wherever they are. This design is very, very popular and the most used when we do animal research. It also allows study of variables which are unethical or impossible to manipulate. So if we still wanted to, for example, study violent video games and their impact on children, we would find children who already play violent video games. So we're not manipulating that variable. It's pre-existing to us. So we would find kids who already do that and observe their results. That would be a far ethical way to go about that research. It can also allow for bigger sample sizes. So we can go to lots of different areas, lots of different schools, lots of different workplaces and observe lots of people at once, increasing our sample size, which is excellent because then it makes it more likely that our results are more representative of the population in question. However, it has its disadvantages as well. It's extremely difficult to replicate the study of an observational design. Because we are simply going and observing our participants, we have little control. So it's very unlikely that what we observe on a Monday, for example, will be exactly the same as what we observe on a Wednesday. We have very little control. We're not really controlling anything. We're just observing the results of natural behaviour. So because of that, it's very difficult to replicate the study. There's also, again, as an extension of that, a lack of control of extraneous variables. So we can't control extraneous variables in an observational design very well. So there's a lot of factors that may influence our dependent variable because of the lack of control that we have, and that's a problem. Now, observer bias can also alter the results. If participants know that they're being watched or they're being observed, they may, through no fault of their own, alter their behaviour or change their behaviour because of that knowledge. And then we're not getting accurate results anyway. So observer bias can be an issue. And like I said before, it does not allow for generalisation of the results. We can't make correlations with this design because we've got no control to do so. So we can only make, at best, associations, and that's a problem. Now, the last design is a qualitative design. This is often referred to as the most simple design, but it is very, very important and very, very useful. So qualitative, it has the word quality in there. So this is the design where we discuss or talk about the topic or the issue or the question being presented to us. So the essential elements of a qualitative design, it uses words and language to gather data. So we have discussion groups or focus groups, surveys and interviews. So we get a lot of quality rich verbal data using this design. Because of that, we can gain in-depth knowledge of a particular topic, and it's also very useful if the topic is not widely known. So let's talk about what we do know first, get a lot of beautiful qualitative data gathered together, and then from there we can, down the track, set up more observational or more experimental designs. So there's different types of qualitative designs, like I just said. So often we do a lot of focus groups. We conduct surveys, and we can also conduct interviews. So focus groups are definitely one of the more popular options for a qualitative design in psychology. So a focus group investigates participants' attitudes on a certain topic. So we gain their attitudes, their opinions, and what they think about a certain topic. Basically, it's an informal interview using a small group of people, usually between 6 to 15. It can be more than that, but that's about average. The focus group is given a series of questions and a facilitator leads the group discussion. So it's the facilitator's job to make sure that everybody has a fair turn, everyone feels safe expressing their attitude and their opinions, and make sure that there's no one dominant member overtaking the group discussion, and obviously keeping them on track as what they should talk about. There's usually also a scribe that records, so either writes down or types up what is being said. In the real world of psychology, sometimes it's actually video recorded or tape recorded. There are some ethical concerns there with confidentiality. So it's typical when we do it at school that someone will write it down or type it up. But it can obviously be recorded just for convenience sake in the real world by a tape recorder or video. Okay, we also can conduct surveys. So this basically uses interviews or a questionnaire to ask people about their attitudes or behaviour about any given topic. The good thing about surveys is that we can send these to large groups of people, so we can get lots of information and lots of data very, very quickly and from a wide variety of people, which is a good thing. So, speaking of good things, what are the advantages of a qualitative design in general? It can be possibly more convenient. Setting up a focus group is fairly straightforward. All we need is some chairs and people sit in a circle. We have a facilitator and a scribe, and away we go. It's very, very easy to set up, in other words. Also, sending out a survey is relatively straightforward, and it's convenient, and it's often a quicker process than developing an experimental design or observational design, which can be quite time-consuming. We can get a lot of significant, rich verbal data, which is excellent. The more data we can get on a certain topic, especially if we don't know a lot about it, the better. The good thing about a qualitative design as well is that opinions can be expressed. With other designs, they often don't get that opportunity. So we're just observing their behavior or we're controlling their behavior. Whereas with this design, we can actually hear why they feel that way, or why they feel a certain way about a certain attitude. So we can get in-depth data where we find out the reasons why, so their opinions can be expressed rather than the other designs kind of limiting that in some instances. And again, like I said before, it's useful if little is known about the topic. So again, let's start with what we do know. Let's talk about what we do know and go from there. However, there's some issues with this design also. Because it's so subjective, we know what that means, subject to bias, we can't generalize the results. So whatever someone talks about in a focus group, we can't necessarily verify what they're saying is true. Also, it's subjective to them and their opinion and their attitudes and their experiences. So we can't assume, in other words, that that's the case for everybody. So we can't generalize the results to everybody in the population, which is an issue. Now, the presence of the observer or the facilitator could affect what is discussed. So just being in a focus group with the facilitator or the other group members, people may feel uncomfortable expressing their true opinions on something, and they may, lie, or they may give socially desirable answers, which isn't actually the case for them. It's not actually true. So then the results are not valid. And of course, there may be bias involved. So people feeling very, very passionately about something, they're going to make that very clear in a focus group or a survey, but their answers are obviously influenced by their own biases and their own opinions, and that may pose a problem in terms of the accuracy of the data. So, easy way to remember all three, guys. Experimental is the design that we control. So we have control of the IV, the setting, the step-by-step instructions, the groups that we randomly allocate. We have the control with this design. So experimental design is the one we control. Observational, as the term suggests, is the design that we observe. So we observe people in their natural setting. We do not manipulate the IV. We are simply observing what is already present. And qualitative is the design that we discuss. So we have discussion groups, focus groups, we send out surveys, conduct interviews, we talk about the question or issue that we're focusing on. So remember this and you'll be fine. So I hope you found this video useful, ladies and gentlemen. As always, if you have any questions, let me know in class or send me an email. Otherwise, happy revising. Bye.